Conservative believes that the first duty of government is to defend the realm.
Conservatives have an instinctive respect for the past.
Well, there used to be a time when the Conservative Party was labelled the stupid party, but I think that was always a bit of a misnomer.
I believe in the rich being rich and looking after the poor, because in my experience, the poor cannot look after themselves.
What did everybody else say?
If you didn't have any criminals, you wouldn't need policemen. And in the same way, if you didn't have people going about with damaging political ideas and nostrums, you wouldn't need the Conservative Party.
On the night of the 1st of May 1997, the Conservative Party suffered its most catastrophic electoral defeat of the century. What was it that had shattered its reputation for consistency and competence? Was it something that had occurred, some error or omission of policy, in the 7 years since Mrs. Thatcher had been deposed? Or was it something that had been accumulating since they first became the party of government in 1922? The Carlton Club is the favourite meeting place for senior Conservatives, a kind of upmarket works canteen. Conservative with a small as well as a large C, club rules prevented women from using the main staircase until the premiership of Margaret Thatcher. And so in 1922, it was the natural setting for the rebellion that founded the modern Conservative Party. The Great War had been fought and won by a coalition government, of which the Tories were by far the largest part. But the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, was a Liberal. Lloyd George was corrupt, he sold honours, his private life, even at a time when newspapers connived at the suppression of scandal, was notorious. There was discontent in the ranks of the Conservative Party, who felt both their career prospects and their interests were jeopardised by LG and the old gang staying in control.
They had got fed up, everyone in the country had got fed up with Lloyd George, and the Conservative members of the coalition were getting uncomfortable, and pressure mounted on the Chief Whip, my great-grandfather George Younger, and so he it was who eventually went to the party leader, Bonar Law, and who went to the party to listen to their complaints, and it all culminated in the famous Carlton Club meeting in 1922, which was organised by George Younger, and the party as a whole met, rather like it does now, decided to withdraw support from the coalition, and that forced a general election in 1922.
The toffs and the grandees suffered from that customary hallucination of politicians that they were indispensable. But the mass of the Conservative Party was sick of the coalition. They wanted to get their hands on power, and they were confident in the innate strength of their grassroots in the country. Effectively, this was a barrack revolution. The troops shot the officers, and the party showed that innate sense of self-preservation that would keep it in power for most of the century.
In the general election that followed, the Conservatives won. The rebels had been vindicated. Andrew Bonar Law, one of the few cabinet ministers who had abandoned the coalition, led the new government. Winston Churchill, then a Liberal, called Bonar Law's new team a government of the Second 11. But England preferred second-class brains to second-class characters. And the party found that it could manage perfectly well without the grandees who had thought themselves essential. In May 1923, less than a year later, Bonar Law discovered that he was dying of cancer. He resigned, and the king had to choose a new prime minister from what was still scathingly referred to as the Second 11. The two contenders were Lord George Nathaniel Curzon and Stanley Baldwin. Baldwin grew up in Bewdley in Worcestershire. His family owned the local steelworks and epitomised a Tory tradition of parochial pride and civic virtue. Baldwin was Chancellor of the Exchequer for Bonar Law, but he had run into trouble when he messed up the American war loan negotiations. Bonar Law was furious. Extraordinarily, he wrote an anonymous leader in the Times criticising his own Chancellor. Lord Curzon lived in Montacute with Eleanor Glynn, the actress immortalised in the anonymous "Would you like to sin with Eleanor Glynn on a tiger skin, or would you prefer to err with her on another fur?" Curzon must have been aware of the ditty since he gave her a tiger skin. She described him as the noblest ruler since Augustus Caesar, who stood over other statesmen as St. Paul's among village churches. Although sadly, in spite of this, by 1923, he had ditched her to make a sensible marriage to heiress Grace Duggan, a pragmatism that was also apparent in his decision to abandon the coalition and join the new government. Curzon was the highest of high Tory aristocrats, but he had a certain superciliousness of manner, and a number of stories circulate that illustrate this. Once, when he saw some soldiers bathing in Palestine, he turned to his ADC and said, "I never realised that the lower classes had such white skins." The sort of remark which, if reported today, would undoubtedly have debarred one from further office. But in Curzon's case, his political achievements were so immense that he was, in fact, the irresistible heir assumptive to Bonar Law. On the 23rd of May, the day after Bonar Law resigned, a letter was delivered from Lord Stamfordham, the King's private secretary, asking for an immediate interview. Curzon set off for London in the triumphant certainty that he had been selected as Bonar Law's successor. When he got to London, Lord Stamfordham told him that the King had decided to send for Stanley Baldwin. Curzon rushed off and sobbed in the lavatory. Curzon had been Viceroy of India. He was at this time Foreign Secretary, and, always a title of ill omen for the incumbent, Deputy Prime Minister. And yet the party had rejected him. The real significance of what had happened was that the aristocracy had forfeited control of the Conservative Party. It would now pass for the rest of the century, with the sole and perfunctory exception of Sir Alec Douglas-Hume, to the bourgeoisie. This was Baldwin's parish church in Worcestershire. All the windows here were made by Burne-Jones and William Morris. Morris propagated a socialist myth of craft, pastoral England. But this beautiful project was paid for by Stanley Baldwin's father. And here is the young Stanley. This old-fashioned, even in 1923, beneficent paternalism was the cornerstone of the vision that Stanley Baldwin successfully sustained in the party and sold to the British people for the next 14 years.
Baldwin never minded using the word England. I mean, nowadays, anyone uses the word England, they're hooted out of town because we're all British. In those days, it was licensed to use the word England.
Baldwin saw himself, and in his radio broadcasts projected himself, as the personification of England.
To me, England is the countryside, and the countryside is England. And there may be those among you who feel as I do. The tinkle of the hammer on the anvil in the country smithy, the last load at night of hay being drawn down the lane, and above all, most subtle, most penetrating, and most moving, the smell of wood smoke in an autumn evening. The love of these things is innate and inherent in our people.
A sentiment consciously echoed by John Major when he rhapsodised about warm beer and cricket in 1993.
Oh yes, I used to see Stanley Baldwin up at Lord's every year at the Eton Harrow match, because he was an old Harrovian and was very keen. He always used to go to Lord's for that match, and he was very hot. He liked to be comfortable, so he retired to the topmost tier of the pavilion, took off his morning coat and his hat, lit a pipe, and sat there obviously enjoying himself in great comfort.
I think he was a much more cunning person than he often let on. But he had this air of beneficence about him, which was helped by his large frame.
Baldwin played on the British distrust of intellectuals. Actually, he was rather sharp, as of course you have to be if you rise to the leadership of the Conservative Party and stay there. Over the next 14 years, he was to weather constitutional crisis, world recession, and inevitably the conspiracies of colleagues. The most conspiratorial, but arguably the most talented of all Baldwin's contemporaries, was Winston Churchill. More than any other politician, except possibly Lloyd George, and he was now finished for good, Churchill had charisma. But he had an erratic reputation. He changed sides. He was associated with military defeat, and his colleagues didn't trust him. Even so, Baldwin decided that he would be less of a threat to the government if he was given a senior position. And so in 1924, to the consternation of many Conservatives, and somewhat to his own surprise, Churchill found himself as Chancellor of the Exchequer.
An old aunt of mine, who I used to discuss politics with, said to me, "Oh no, dear, some of us, if we'd known that that man was going to be Chancellor, we wouldn't have voted Tory."
In those days, of course, economic policy, still less the concept of a managed economy, was almost unheard of. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was really little more than a glorified bookkeeper. And yet, within a short time of assuming the office, Churchill found himself embroiled in a problem which embraced every aspect of the country's declining power. The pound, or sovereign as it then was, had been taken off the gold standard during the First World War. Churchill brought us back to the gold standard, but he took the pound in at too high a rate. Neither the country's industrial strengths nor our reserves of foreign currency were strong enough to survive this misvaluation undamaged. There was a lesson here, though few in the party picked it up. Power is based on industrial strength, and Britain was no longer a world power. The Tories' failure to adjust to Britain's decline would reveal itself in various episodes of danger and humiliation over the next 50 years. After this incident of economic mismanagement, the Tories found themselves up to their necks in a crisis of industrial relations. The artificially strong pound had made coal difficult to sell abroad. Wages were actually cut by the mine owners. And in 1926, the miners' dispute brought the whole trade union movement out in Britain's first and only general strike. There were many in the party, particularly Churchill, who wanted to turn it into a full-scale confrontation. And they were matched by trade union leaders, whose language was far more extreme and inflammatory than anything in 1974 or 1984. It must be realized that for the last 150 years, the propertied class had been haunted by the spectre of the mob. This shadow is never far distant. Only 9 years earlier, the Tsar, cruelest and it seemed most secure of all the tyrants, had been deserted by his guards and with his wife and little children butchered. For many in the middle classes, the Conservative Party seemed to offer the sole political defense against anarchy. Volunteer drivers for buses and lorries were recruited from ex-officers and from the universities. This was class war. The BBC, which Churchill wanted to commandeer for the government's cause, retained its independence by failing to report anything contrary to the government's wishes. Lord Reith helped Baldwin write his radio broadcasts. Unlike his more belligerent colleagues, and indeed successors, Baldwin did not want to crush the miners. Instead, he negotiated a face-saving settlement and kept his party and country united. Yet when 3 years later the slump began, the unions had no fight left in them. As was to happen in the 1980s, fear of unemployment replaced union militancy with despair and dejection. What was the point of striking when the order book was empty? The paternalistic Tory ideal of a ruling class who looked after their social inferiors, which underpinned Baldwin's idealized English myth, could only take so much punishment. The working class had been sacrificed in 1914, 15, 16 and 17 at Ypres, Luz, the Somme and Passchendaele by their leaders. Now they were the victims of another huge betrayal. There was no New Deal, no action, no succour. The Conservative government also faced problems in the Empire. It was becoming clear that eventually the British would have to leave India. The Indians didn't want the British ruled India by force, and it was getting increasingly difficult. The Viceroy was Halifax.
They'd been on some tour, and they arrived early foggy morning, and my mother said, "We've just been bombed," and this was an attempt to do in the Viceroy on his way back from his tour.
Halifax and Baldwin bowed to the inevitable and began to make concessions to Indian separatism, provoking a furious response from their own backbenches.
India was, in a sense, very much part of the career structure of certain families in England. They'd been on the civil service out there. They'd been in the army. Many had been in the services. We had a big army out there, and this went back a long way. The very notion that these people could get on without us was, of course, very disturbing to certain minds.
There were one or two people who never really got used to it at all, and I suppose the most famous of them all was Winston Churchill. And he talked about the Gandhis striding up the steps of the viceregal house to see the Viceroy, and how wrong it was for the Viceroy to lure himself to talk on level terms with this naked fakir, as he called him.
I was consigned as a reporter on the Morning Post to concentrate on politics about India in the countryside, in the country. So, and I travelled to different constituencies where hopefully we thought there would be a row. So I became fairly familiar with the pull and push that went on inside the Tory party. Now, it had, of course, the side effect of, I won't say discrediting Winston, but putting a question mark over Winston's judgment.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are shortly to be faced with a general election. Now, in choosing a team for cricket or football to represent the country in international matches, you pay great attention to the records of the players, and no less attention is necessary in choosing a government.
The electorate did pay attention to the record of the government, and the Tories lost. Now Baldwin faced problems inside the party. He once said that leading the Conservative Party was like driving pigs to market, but now the pigs were getting different ideas. Lord Beaverbrook owned the Daily Express, the Evening Standard, and the Glasgow Herald. He was flamboyant, impatient, and powerful.
I mean, he didn't have any looks in the ordinary sense. He had long legs and a pot belly. I mean, like a sort of barrel. And then this wonderful face on top. And, of course, more charm than anybody I've ever met. If he wanted to charm, he could charm the birds off the trees. I mean, he was absolutely extraordinary. I adored him.
Max Beaverbrook was a backstage intriguer of long standing. In 1922, he'd helped propel Bonar Law to power, but now he was disillusioned with his successor. Beaverbrook launched a new single-issue party. The issue was tariff reform, but his real purpose was to get rid of Baldwin.
Beaverbrook came to believe that Baldwin was one of the most disastrous prime ministers we've ever had in our history of our country. Partly it was due to original arguments that they'd had.
Well, Stanley Baldwin was too boring for Max. You know, Max wanted to be amused or intrigued, or, I mean, he thought Stanley Baldwin was hopeless because Max thought he was too stupid.
In 1931, Beaverbrook put up a candidate in the Westminster by-election. But, just as in 1997, the British electorate distrusted a tycoon's single-issue party, and he lost. Then the minority Labour government collapsed. The Tories won the election. But in spite of a large majority, Baldwin joined forces with the Labour Party and formed a national government.
We have not cared among us who made the runs, provided that the runs were made.
Baldwin saw his new coalition as the best bet for his brand of moderate conservatism. It outflanked the Tory right, and it kept his political enemies, Lloyd George and Churchill, out of the government. Those who take pot shots at Santa Claus need not, as Beaverbrook remarked, expect any presents if they miss. What was the Conservative voter of 1931 like? A populist policy for wider home ownership meant that upwardly mobile working-class families were voting Tory. Above all, people felt safe with them. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became the German Chancellor. The Tory party attitude to Hitler was ambivalent. A rabble-rouser, certainly, not over-scrupulous in his use of violence, but determinedly anti-communist. To many conservatives, Hitler seemed an improvement on the various thugs who had wandered on and off the disorderly stage of German politics since the end of World War I.
He was soundly anti-red and got on well with big business. Moreover, he seemed to offer a reliable protection against the mob.
course, Hitler was every now and again sending people to explain to us that he wanted very good relations with England as a fellow Aryan country, you see, and he had nothing against us as a great colonial power. And some people, of course, were rather impressed by all this kind of thing.
By 1935, Hitler was engaged on a massive program of military expansion. But Stanley Baldwin understood his electorate. He knew the British people would not vote for an equivalent British rearmament program.
There was a sort of national psychosis left by the effects of that First World War. A deep reluctance to feel that we must move in any direction that could lead to another war.
I will never stand for a policy of great armament. And I give you my word, and I think you can trust me by now, that our defense program will be no more than is sufficient to make our country safe and enable us to fulfill our obligations. That much we must have.
The Conservatives won the 1935 election. The party supported Baldwin because he could deliver the electorate. He understood the people of England. But by now he had been in the job for 13 years. His reserves of energy, never high, were ebbing. And, as is inevitably the case with long-running leaders, he had accumulated a number of enemies inside his own party. Here at Lord Winterton's country house in Sussex, on the 22nd of May 1936, there assembled a group of Tory notables. Among them, Austin Chamberlain, Churchill, a couple of heavyweight backbenchers. There was no formal agenda, no notes were taken, no civil servants were present. Discussions, which were long, will have taken place over and after dinner. The news leaked. Baldwin knew at once what was up, and his dismissive comment was, "This is the time of year when midges come out of dirty ditches." Later that year, King George V died, and Baldwin was faced with a constitutional crisis. Edward VIII was in love with an American divorcee, and he wanted to marry her.
He was a very self-centered individual. I mean, everybody knows what it's like to be in love with somebody like he was with Mrs. Simpson, and to feel that life can't go on without her and all that. But I'm afraid he does emerge as a rather limited man.
You could see Wallis's attraction, but she wasn't at all nice, I didn't think. She said that she owed £700 to the bank or something like that, and the Prince of Wales had given her the money. And she said, I don't know what to do, whether to pay off my overdraft or go and buy some clothes in Paris. And I said, well, you're absolutely crazy, go and buy some clothes in Paris. You'll get plenty of money later on.
For Baldwin, as for the rest of the British establishment, Mrs. Simpson was an opportunity disguised as a crisis. For the last 10 years, they had been racking their brains concerning what should be done about the Prince of Wales. He was selfish, erratic, impatient of protocol, and prone to leftish enthusiasms.
The blackest part of all in his visit was at Dulles, where there were once 9,000 men at work in the steel factory. Everything is now derelict and deserted, but His Majesty brought hope to replace despair. Something will be done, the King said.
As battle lines were drawn, Churchill and Beaverbrook championed the King's cause, motivated by a potent blend of romantic ideal and political opportunism.
It was a mistake, if you like, from both Churchill's point of view and Beaverbrook's, but it was more arising from their personal friendship with the Prince and their personal hatred of Baldwin than anything else.
The abdication was the last great establishment coup dressed up as high-mindedness. If Baldwin had really wanted, he could have kept Edward on the throne. bought off Ernest Simpson, blocked the divorce. In my view, he could probably have bought off Wallis as well by offering her everything she wanted, short of a coronation in Westminster Abbey. But he didn't. And in a bravura sleight of hand, the Prime Minister got rid of the King, appearing at the same time to be his most loyal subject.
Baldwin told Edward that if he married Mrs. Simpson, she would become Queen, and he knew that the people of England would not tolerate this. And when Churchill stood up in the House of Commons to demand that the King be given more time, MPs felt he was manipulating the crisis for his own political ends and booed him into silence.
It was another example of Baldwin pulling one over Beaverbrook, because Beaverbrook in the Daily Express was quite anxious for the King to stay. I mean, and Churchill, that was one of Churchill's errors of judgment. Churchill was against Baldwin and was very, well, he was on the King's side. So to defeat Churchill and Beaverbrook, as it were, with a left and a right, it was quite a performance by Stanley. Yes, he looked deceptively idle, but in fact he was quite quick on his feet.
Few seem to have realised what this implied for the Tories or their constitutional raison d'etre. Since the Civil War, they had been the King's party. Now, for their own political convenience, they had connived at making the monarch disposable. Nothing now could go wrong, and a compliant, orthodox and public-spirited king would be substituted for an erratic princeling. The crown, with all its residual authority of prerogative, would henceforth be subordinate to advice, and the advice over the next decade would be coming to it from the Tory party.
Baldwin retired gracefully as his new king was crowned.
The final speech was about a big colliery strike that was threatening the Harworth colliery. And when the debate opened, Baldwin got up to make the speech and sat. I can see him now at the box with very few notes on the dispute itself, and then drifting into a bit of industrial philosophy, and then finishing up by saying that the new king and queen are coming to the most tremendous task on earth, and I appeal to that handful of men, meaning the colliers of Harworth, to give the nation the greatest gift in their possession, peace in our time.
Peace in our time. The phrase was made notorious by Chamberlain, but it can be found in the Book of Common Prayer and was first quoted by Baldwin when he persuaded the party to take a non-confrontational attitude to the unions in 1924. By including it in his final speech 13 years later, Baldwin tried, perhaps a little pretentiously, to write the epitaph on his own premiership. The succession passed smoothly to Baldwin's long-term second-in-command, Neville Chamberlain.
Chamberlain's background at that time was very strong. He'd been an excellent Minister of Health. He'd done a lot of slum clearance. On the domestic front, he was very, very strong indeed. Furthermore, he'd been Chancellor of the Exchequer from the recession, 1931 or 2, onwards in the national government. That's a pretty strong track record for a Prime Minister to have.
Chamberlain was a very able man, certainly. But he was a singularly unattractive one, really. One can't sort of think, oh, that's a dear old man. He didn't look like that at all. He always gave me the impression he was inclined to have a nasty smell under his nose.
The people must be strong and healthy. They should have leisure, refreshment and recreation. They should be able to cultivate taste for beautiful things, whether in nature or in art, and to open their minds to the wisdom that is to be found in books.
However, the dominant issue facing the new Prime Minister was not adult education, but foreign affairs. Chamberlain was completely clear on the limitations on Britain's power. The population of Great Britain was 47 million. That of Germany was 80 million. Their production of steel was half as much again as ours. Of manufactured goods, they produced more than Britain and any other European country combined. Chamberlain was above all a realist. He knew that if he was to keep Britain out of war, she had to be able to defend herself. But he framed the rearmament program around equipment like the Spitfire and the secret radar which guided it, that would allow us to defend ourselves as an island. He didn't neglect or overlook expenditure on the army, he simply refused to authorize it. He believed that if we were manifestly incapable of intervening in Europe, then we would have to stay out. But this policy suffered from two impediments: the personalities of two men who were determined to thwart him, Churchill and Hitler. Hitler behaved in the most impossible fashion, although it must be acknowledged that being brutal and anti-Semitic was not in itself a drawback when it came to the Conservative Party in the 30s. He ranted and raved in public, he accused the British government of being in the pay of the Jews, he taunted the country as being decadent and feeble. While Churchill, having lost the Prince of Wales and given up on India, was now campaigning full blast on the Nazi threat.
For me, Winston was a menace. He was barely in the Conservative Party, you know, he was just a nuisance. He really was something of a thorn in Mr. Chamberlain's flesh.
If there was one person who Chamberlain disliked more than Churchill, it was the Foreign Secretary, who he had inherited from Baldwin. Anthony Eden was young, glamorous, and intensely charismatic. He was notorious in the Foreign Office for thrashing his subordinates at tennis.
Mrs. Chamberlain did mention quite frequently that Anthony was being difficult, or there would have to be change. Yes, there was strain, no shadow of doubt about it.
Chamberlain greatly preferred to discuss foreign affairs with Edward Earl Halifax. And the Germans, well aware of this, decided to sideline Anthony Eden and invite Halifax to Germany. The invitation came via the editor of The Field magazine.
Goering, who was occupying then a very important part in the German hierarchy, invited my father to come and shoot foxes. And my father, as a fox hunter all his life, hadn't been used to shooting foxes, but thought it might be quite amusing to accept. And I think realized, obviously at the time, that after a bit of fox shooting, he might be invited to see the Führer.
Chamberlain said go ahead, in spite of Eden's complaints. Eden was in bed with flu, but got up and went round and saw Chamberlain and complained in person. But at the end of their stormy meeting, all the Prime Minister could manage to say was, go back to bed and take an aspirin.
Britain's envoy has proved himself such an expert on the subject of hunting that the Germans have dubbed him Sir Tallyhofax. And though the guest sticks to his bowler, the host wears the sort of hat that would create a diversion in Piccadilly.
He thought he was a bit of a, I mean, he was a not wholly unattractive joke, I think, with all these sort of medals and in his sort of shooting clothes and his jacket and his little hat. He thought he was almost a sort of figure one might have seen in the pantomime at Leeds.
Halifax's attitude to Goering, as reported by his son, is extraordinary. This insular hauteur, typical of a certain kind of Englishman, may have been acceptable in the Shires, But in relation to a man as ruthless and formidable as Goering, it was, to say the least, unwise. By now, Anthony Eden felt he was neither liked, trusted, nor consulted by his Prime Minister.
Neville Chamberlain was like that. He was he was a very strong man. He had his own policy. Anthony, at that time, was not, of course, the distinguished Foreign Secretary with a long record of achievement behind him. He'd become Foreign Secretary very young, and I suppose Chamberlain rather treated him accordingly.
Tensions between the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary occur many times and with varying degrees of intensity in the history of the party, and Eden himself was to suffer from this some 15 years later. But for the time being, he had had enough, and on the 20th of February 1938, he resigned from the government.
Number 17 Fitzharding Street is Mr. Eden's home. He leaves to make his speech of explanation and to confirm the impression that at 40, resigned, he still has a big political future before him.
Now Edward Earl Halifax abandoned his country estate to become Foreign Secretary. Halifax was the quintessential English gentleman. His political intelligence was considerable, but neither his character nor his background equipped him for negotiation with Nazi Germany.
Well, Halifax, of course, had been one of Chamberlain's inner circle. I mean, Foreign Office always likes to have a Foreign Secretary who carries weight with the Prime Minister of the day, and from that point of view, obviously, he was better than Anthony Eden.
Chamberlain and Halifax both knew that Britain simply was not strong enough to settle a European balance on her own. So appeasement was incontestably the logical policy. But it ran into this problem. Hitler just would not be appeased or cooperate in any way. First he took back the Rhineland, then Austria, then threatened war against Czechoslovakia.
The showdown came in September 1938 at Munich. And here Chamberlain found himself in the uncomfortable position of having, in order to avoid a world war for which Britain was both mentally and physically unprepared, to compel the Czechs to give Hitler what he wanted.
Down the bright, straight road towards a new understanding in Europe. Let no man criticize the bargain that the statesmen of Britain and France have struck until he has attempted to add up the total price that might have had to be paid for any other settlement, a price in death and destruction.
I mean, the idea that Chamberlain was a rather weak sort of man, far, far from it. He was very strong. And in many ways, he had the same kind of conviction of his rightness and strength of purpose, and refusal to allow anybody else to deflect him from his policies that Margaret Thatcher had later.
That the settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
Munich and its popular reception showed Chamberlain's instincts were sound. Foolishly, in party terms, he did not go to the country. Had he secured a popular mandate for appeasement with a general election, his political position would have been almost unassailable.
I mean, it was really quite overwhelming, the gifts that came in, you know. Perfectly wonderful gifts like the little crucifix from the Pope, the Bechstein piano, the Hardy fishing rods, the umbrellas, the pictures, very often paintings of him as a flying angel and so on. Mrs. Chamberlain received a magnificent black velvet hat from one of the leading Paris milliners. She never wore it, you know, but there was such an outburst of gratitude from all over the world. He did want peace, and honestly believed momentarily, that perhaps he'd achieved it.
23rd of August 1939. The Soviet-Nazi pact was a bolt from the blue. Hitler had done a deal with the communist mob. Now there was no counterweight to German aggression in the east. There were worries that the more militant trade unions wouldn't support a war, and Poland was doomed. Someone found Chamberlain in tears, saying, "All my work is undone." And 9 days later, the Germans invaded Poland. As the tanks rolled across the border, the Conservative government engaged in frenzied negotiations. Chamberlain's ultimatum expired, but still he delayed the declaration of war.
The ultimatum expired, I suppose, at midnight or sometime like that. And I'd gone to bed and was almost asleep. It was the first time a good night's sleep. And the telephone rang. And there was a Swedish businessman called Daleros. And he said, "I'm at Goering's country house outside Berlin, which is called Karienhau, and the Reich Marshal is by my side. And he wants you to make another effort and to go and see the Prime Minister and to say it is still possible to avoid the war." So I knew perfectly well there was no question of going back on our ultimatum, and no point at all. And Goering was not running German policy either. So I'm afraid I took it upon myself to say no, I'm afraid it's too late.
This is an interesting piece of testimony, and there can be no doubt that that telephone call was genuine. But Frank Roberts was greatly exceeding his authority, as senior civil servants often do.
However reluctant Chamberlain was to declare war, by now he had no choice. Neither he nor anyone else could continue to believe in the possibility of doing a deal with Hitler.
The situation was impossible, both from the diplomatic and from the public opinion and from the military point of view. Munich was a tripwire. It was thus far and no further. The tripwire had been sprung.
On the 3rd of September 1939, the Prime Minister finally declared war on Germany.
Neville Chamberlain's position was now an impossible one. He was Prime Minister of a country at war, but had staked his political life on maintaining the peace. For the party, the failure of appeasement would blight its fortunes and affect its foreign policy for almost 40 years. For Chamberlain, that failure was to prove fatal. And Churchill, vindicated at last, was waiting in the wings.